they would actually buy the heads of seminary seats, right? Oh, we'll donate you, $1 million to your seminary, but you got to put in, Reverend, Reverend limp hands, if you know what I mean, right?
Tonight we're going to talk about the infiltration of the Protestant church by the LGBTQ Outreach. I've come across these programs as I've been researching this. I do a lot of debates against transgenders and people who are homosexual advocates. And one of the things that I found is that a lot of their financial documents from large groups, this would include groups like Family Equality, etc. They often run finance programs that have massive outreach to LGBTQ churches. And I was wondering if you had kind of come across that in any of your research and kind of could outline for us maybe what you found or not found on that.
Well, my knowledge of this topic is situated in the larger domain of what's called soft power. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, and probably a lot of listeners might not be familiar with this idea unless they happen to maybe study international relations or have family members or people like that who know this topic. And if you take classes in international relations, you learn about how various power structures influence. And one of the things that the modern world has created, which, I mean, it existed in ancient world as well, but one of the things that's kind of unique is soft power and now what's called smart power. So more relevant to this talk would be the topic of smart power. And that's the idea of, or soft power, using money and NGOs and think tanks to accomplish your ends, as opposed to more top-down, hard-fisted attempts at forcing people to your views. So it actually comes out of international relations and geopolitics, this way of trying to, everybody knows, for example, about how much money probably the U.S. gives to other countries, right? So we give millions and millions of dollars across the board every year. You can see a list of how much money was given to Colombia, how much money was given to Egypt, et cetera. And it's just tremendous amounts of money, and a big part of that is to influence the way that policy in those countries is made. And so in the same way, if you look at, for example, there's a famous old lecture by Norman Dodd on YouTube, and he looked into the tax-exempt foundations. And so that's really the model that the real wealth and real money, real power elite have used in the 20th century, particularly in the last 50 years or so, is to influence through those more covert or the cover of human rights. Okay, so human rights is the ultimate great cover for these things, which used to be what military operations or intelligence operations would do. It used to be even maybe before the 80s, the CIA would be engaged in these kinds of operations in the Cold War, right? And then after Reagan, a lot of that became privatized. A lot of it switched over into non-governmental organizations and think tanks and what we call now soft power. So everybody's probably familiar with George Soros and his foundation, right? And what the Soros Foundation, Open Society Institute, right? What they foster in other countries. And this is really just the model that the old moneyed elite in the U.S., the big families, the Rockefellers, JP Morgan, what they did with creating tax-exempt foundations and then, flushing money through those things, and having a lot more power and influence covertly and overtly as well through these pseudo humanitarian means. And if you don't understand that, it's really impossible to understand how the modern world actually functions. Most people don't understand that that's really the power structure. NGOs, think tanks, steering committees, right? These are the things that really change society. The RAND Corporation, right?
It's kind of like a filtration system.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why do you think that they target churches specifically so often?
Well, there's a good chapter in the Collier and Horowitz book, The Rockefeller Family. It's about the dynasty of the Rockefellers. It's the authorized biography. And it goes into the history of the ecumenist movement. And at the end of the last century, well, the 19th century, the Rockefeller family was, really rising in power, and they saw the ability to take churches and basically turn churches into NGOs. And so they said, why don't we just use a lot of these existing Protestant organizations as if they were another way to promote Americanism or soft power, or in the case of the Rockefeller social gospel, the liberal social gospel. There's a whole chapter in there about the social gospel and the ecumenist movement. And so they saw that as just another way of extending their power and extending Americanism. And so the easiest churches to do that with are Protestants, because they're decentralized oftentimes, in the sense that they don't have a hierarchy most of the time. Some of them do, but most Protestant churches aren't a hierarchy. They're kind of loose groups, and they can be easily influenced by academia. So what the Rockefellers would do is the same thing that they would do with state education, is that they would basically just build a school and give a bunch of money to that school, and that makes it a prominent school. And then you create the departments at those schools, like sociology or, international relations at University of Chicago. That's like basically a giant Rockefeller school. So in the same way, they would actually buy the heads of seminary seats, right? Oh, we'll donate you, $1 million to your seminary, but you got to put in, Reverend limp hands, if you know what I mean, right? So Reverend limp hands has to be, Pastor Bruce has to be in charge of the theology department, literally, and he's going to train everybody. That's literally how it works. Okay, so it's easiest with the Protestant model, but if you look at the history of Protestantism in the U.S., that's quite literally how the Protestant church was liberalized within a few decades. And even Protestant ministers back in the day, for example, J. Gresham Machen wrote a whole book called What is Liberalism? And that was about how the Protestant churches have been liberalized. He doesn't hint at or hit on the NGOs, but he basically saw the patterns of how quickly it was done within a few decades of turning the mainline Protestant denominations liberal. And it was basically these entities, these very wealthy families and power structures that did that on record. And it's a pattern that works. And they do the exact same thing with Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. It's that simple. And so I just covered pretty recently, actually, very prominent Roman Catholic lawyer's book, David Wimhoff, John Courtney Maury, Time, Life, and the American Proposition, How the CIA's Doctrinal Warfare Program Changed the Catholic Church, by David Wimhoff. This is a gigantic 800-page tome, thousands of footnotes. And his assessment there is that this is what they did in the Roman Catholic Church to change it. And it's no different than what they do in the Protestant Church. And it's the same people. So it's that simple.
Right. You made a very good point before you speed past it. It was in one of the questions I really wanted to ask you. I agree with you on the seminaries have been infiltrated, and we should not be sending any of our kids there anymore, honestly, because I don't know if you've seen the clips from 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago, where they have people actually promoting Marxist propaganda in seminary, talking about, equality and stuff like that. But you hit the nail on the head with this one question: what is the social gospel? Can you tell the listeners about that?
So this was an idea that arose in liberal Protestant circles and amongst Jesuits maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago. And the idea was that Christianity isn't really a supernatural theological message. It's a socio-political message about liberation from oppression. And so a lot of people believed that when it was getting popular in Latin South America via very liberal Jesuits that were promoting it, a lot of people think, oh, those were just Marxists. Those were Marxist Jesuits that were promoting this. And there's an element to which that's true. However, in my view, what's oftentimes the case is that whenever you see Marxists or Marxist groups, you can find a very wealthy individual in the background. So Marxist groups almost always have very wealthy backers, because if you look at the history of revolutions don't occur without funding. You can't have a revolution without somebody putting money into your organization. And if we look again to the the soft power model of the 80s, which is where we got, for example, color revolutions, it's another example of something similar to the social gospel, which is that it may give the appearance of liberalism, atheism, Marxism, but really there's a lot of money behind these groups. And the Rockefellers have famously promoted leftist causes for the last 100 years. And there's actually a chapter in the Rockefellers biography about how John D. Rockefeller said that he really appreciated the social gospel over against the traditional Protestant, fundamentalist view, because the social gospel could turn the church into an NGO, basically. And of course, liberation theology is something that comes along later, but it's basically the same idea that the social gospel is removing the supernatural elements and making Christianity into an NGO. And that's really what liberation theology is. It's the same idea, but just throwing in like some Marxist stuff that Jesus is here to, redeem the poor oppressed people from the, moneyed class, the bourgeoisie or whatever. So they relate to one another, but it's really just an attempt to demythologize, and the demytholization project of the liberal theologians in Protestantism have again typically had these big money NGOs and foundations and families behind them. And so again, you look at the Wim Hof book, he traces it in exactly the same pattern for the Roman Catholic Church. And it's no different than the Orthodox Church. We have the same big money entities and groups putting, essentially people into seminaries, donating to seminaries to control the type of theology that is taught to the next generation. And last thing I'll say is that if you look at the figure of Gene Sharp, he's another classic example of this. He's the guy who patented the technology of using democratic revolutions as a strategy, a technique of regime change that gives the appearance of human rights. And this is was perfected at the Albert Einstein Institute. It's basically a CIA front. It was used a lot in the 80s. They used it first in Serbia, and that was the Rose Revolution. It was used in the Ukraine, called the Orange Revolution. Everybody saw what happened in 2011. That was the result of many years of this color revolution model. We've seen many of these, and that's a strategy. It's a technique. It's not Marxist proper. It's low IQ student age people who believe Marxism, or religious leaders or professors that believe Marxism, who have a layer of people above them that are extremely wealthy, who fund that layer of dupes and idiots.
Right. You said, Andrew, do you want to put in a question?
No, go ahead.
Awesome. So you said something critical there too. You said changing the theology, which is really just manipulating the curriculum, right?
Well, no, it's not just that. It's installing specific people in the heads of departments.
Right. In order so they can start pushing their message, which.
Yeah, I mean, in other words, it has to be a liberal theologian, whoever, Father so-and-so, Reverend Bruce, who's essentially raised. He's the guy they want. In the Rockefeller's biography, it was Fosdick. So Fosdick, I think, was a super liberal Presbyterian guy, and he was like the archetype of what they wanted in theological seminaries to train the next generation. And Fosdick was like some crazy, like super liberal dude.
Right. And I think I see this because when I interact with people who say, yeah, man, I just graduated seminary, but they've never read the Apostolic Fathers, right? They've never even, the biggest thing, their original languages, Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic. They tell me, yeah, I only needed to take 3 months and then I got the credits for that class. And I'm like, someone let you say that you went in through a course and added to your transcripts that you practiced Greek or you studied Greek when you only did 3 to 4 months of it. I think that's critically like a reason why you can't trust these seminaries and why they should just be, just thrown over the rail completely. Because why? When we are trying to, like you said, form our theology and put it out in a coherent manner, and then you have these people here who don't even know what they believe actually, they get to do things like what? Make up what we're talking about. Gay marriage in your churches. You see people actually sending money into Planned Parenthood. You can't even get your preacher to stand up and say cogently on the board, yeah, we're going to be against Planned Parenthood. We are running a ministry specifically for protesting the local abortion clinic in our area. Who wants to sign up? You don't see that happening a lot. You see it in a few spotty places, but you don't see it a lot. Why?